The women who terrified the Caribbean, Anne Bonny and Mary Red. In October of 1720, a small sloop called the William was anchored off the coast of Jamaica. It was night. The crew had been drinking heavily, as they often did when there was nothing to hunt and nowhere to be. Most of them were asleep below deck, sprawled in their hammocks, insensible, their weapons lying on the floor beside them. A Royal Navy sloop came out of the darkness without warning. When the soldiers boarded, they expected resistance. They found instead a ship full of unconscious men and the wreckage of a night's hard drinking. The great pirate crew of Calico Jack Rackham, a crew that had terrorized the Caribbean for over a year, surrendered without a fight. Almost without a fight. Because when the soldiers came over the railing, two figures met them on deck. Two people who had heard the attack coming grabbed their weapons and chose to stand their ground while every man around them lay sleeping. Both of them were women. Their names were Anne Bonny and Mary Reed, and their story is one of the most extraordinary in the entire history of the sea, not because they were pirates, but because of the world they had to become pirates in, and everything they had to leave behind to do it. Tonight, we tell their story. Anne Bonny was born into contradiction. She came into the world sometime around 1700, the illegitimate daughter of an Irish lawyer named William Cormac and his housemaid. In the rigid social world of early 18th century Ireland, this was a birth that carried shame for her mother, for her father, and for the child herself. Her father tried at first to disguise her existence by dressing her as a boy and passing her off as a young clerk's apprentice in his household. It did not work. The secret got out, and when the scandal became too great to contain, William Cormac did what many men of ambition and few scruples have done throughout history. He left. He took Anne and her mother and sailed for the American colonies, settling eventually in the Carolinas, where no one knew his name or his history. There, he rebuilt himself, became a successful merchant and landowner, gave Anne a comfortable, prosperous upbringing, and prepared for her, as was the custom of the time, a future that consisted primarily of a good marriage to a suitable man. Anne had other ideas. The accounts that survive describe a young woman of fierce temper and considerable physical courage, qualities that were admirable in men and deeply inconvenient in women in that time and place. There are stories, possibly apocryphal, of her attacking a servant who assaulted her with a knife. What is certain is that she was not a woman who accepted the boundaries drawn for her. When she was still a teenager, she married a small-time sailor and would-be pirate named James Bonny, a match her father so violently opposed that he threw her out of his house. James Bonny turned out to be exactly as unimpressive as her father had suspected. He brought her to Nassau in the Bahamas, a chaotic, lawless pirate haven at the heart of the Caribbean world, and then proceeded to make himself useful to the new governor, Woodes Rogers, by informing on pirates. He had chosen the wrong side in the wrong town with the wrong wife. In Nassau, Anne Bonny met Calico Jack Rackham. His real name was John Rackham, and he was called Calico Jack because of his fondness for calico print trousers, a piece of vanity that said something about the kind of man he was. He was charming, reckless, and bold in the specific way that men are bold when they have not yet faced the consequences of their boldness. He was also, at the time he met Anne, a pirate of some local reputation, recently come off a period of sailing under another captain. Anne Bonny left her husband for him almost immediately. She did not sneak away. She did not ask permission. She petitioned, formally, legally, for what was then called a divorce by sale, in which a husband could agree to give up his wife for a sum of money. James Bonny refused. Woodes Rogers, the governor, threatened to have her flogged for adultery. Anne Bonny went to sea instead. She joined Rackham's crew, took her place among the pirates, and, by every account that survives, fought alongside them as an equal. She did not stand at the back. She did not watch from a distance. She worked the ship, she handled weapons, and when there was fighting to be done, she was part of it. She was, by all evidence, exactly where she had always wanted to be. Mary Reed's story begins before she was born. Her mother had been married to a sailor who went to sea and never came back, a common enough story in the maritime world of the late 17th century. While he was gone, she became pregnant by another man, and when the baby, a boy, was born and then died in infancy, she found herself in a desperate situation: a widow with no income, a secret pregnancy, and a society that had very little patience for women who had fallen into either condition. Her solution was an act of survival that would shape her daughter's entire life. When Mary was born, her mother dressed her as a boy. She presented her to her late husband's mother, the baby's grandmother, as a grandson. The old woman, deceived, provided financial support. And so Mary Reed grew up not as a girl, but as a boy, wearing boys' clothes, learning boys' skills, inhabiting a boy's world from the very first moment she could understand the world at all. When the grandmother died and the money ran out, Mary, still dressed as a man, went out to find work. She found it on a warship, then in the army, serving in Flanders during the War of the Spanish Succession. There, she fell in love with a fellow soldier, revealed herself to him, and for a brief period lived as a woman openly, married, settled, running a small inn in Holland with her husband. Then her husband died. With the war ending and her income gone, Mary Reed made the only decision that made sense for a woman of her skills and her history. She put her men's clothes back on. She signed onto a ship bound for the West Indies. The ship was taken by pirates, and Mary Reed, rather than being ransomed or set ashore, made the same calculation that men throughout the Caribbean were making in those years. She joined them. She was already on Rackham's ship, already established as a member of the crew, when Anne Bonny arrived. The two women found each other in a world that had no category for either of them, and by every account that survives, they became close. Not in the romantic way that some later writers have imagined, but in the way of people who recognize in each other a particular kind of loneliness, the loneliness of living in a world that has never quite had a place for you. Mary Reed fought. By multiple accounts, she was one of the most ferocious fighters on the ship. There's a story, recorded in the most important primary source of the era, Captain Charles Johnson's General History of the Pirates, of a young man on the crew whom Mary had come to care for, who found himself challenged to a duel by an older, more experienced sailor. Fearing for his life, he was reluctant to face the fight. Mary Reed challenged the older sailor herself. She fought him, and she killed him. The young man was spared. It is the kind of story that is almost impossible to verify 3 centuries later, but it is the kind of story that only gets told about real people. Life aboard the William was not the stuff of romantic legend. It was a small ship, a cramped crew, and the reality of piracy in 1720 was that the Golden Age was already dying. Woodes Rogers had cleaned up Nassau. The Royal Navy was patrolling the Caribbean with increasing aggression. The great prizes were harder to find. The Noose and Execution dock in London swung regularly. and the names on the death warrants were becoming more and more familiar. Calico Jack's crew was not among the most successful of the era. They operated in the waters around Jamaica and Cuba, taking small vessels, fishing boats, merchant sloops, coastal traders. The plunder was modest, the risks were not. What set the William apart, what gave it a reputation that outlasted the careers of far more successful pirate ships, was its 2 female crew members. The existence of women on a pirate vessel was not entirely unheard of, but it was extraordinarily rare. Most pirate articles specifically forbade women aboard, for the straightforward reason that their presence was considered a source of conflict and distraction. Rackham's articles apparently contained no such prohibition, or if they did, he chose to ignore it. Anne Bonny and Mary Read were known to the crews of every vessel they encountered. Their reputations preceded them. Captured sailors testified in court that the 2 women were among the most aggressive fighters on the ship, that they cursed louder than the men, worked harder than many of them, and in moments of combat were among the last to pull back. One captured fisherman, giving testimony at the subsequent trial, said that he had been more afraid of the women than of the men. It is a sentence worth sitting with for a moment. In a world that had told both of them, from birth, what they were allowed to be and what they were not. In a world that had offered Anne Bonny a comfortable life of domesticity, and Mary Read a series of disguises to wear and roles to perform, both women had arrived at the same place by very different roads. And in that place, on the deck of a small pirate sloop in the Caribbean, they had become themselves. The night of October 22nd, 1720 began like many others. The William was anchored in a quiet cove off the northern coast of Jamaica. The crew had been drinking. There was rum, and there was nothing pressing to do, and the particular danger of their lives had perhaps that night receded into the background noise of daily existence, the way danger tends to do when it has not yet arrived. Captain Jonathan Barnett found them there. Barnett was a privateer operating under a commission from the governor of Jamaica, one of the pirate hunters that the colonial authorities were increasingly deploying against the remnants of the Golden Age. He was experienced, well armed, and he had been looking for Calico Jack for some time. When his sloop came out of the darkness and fired a warning shot across the William's bow, the response from Rackham's crew was almost nothing. Most of them were below deck, too drunk to fight, perhaps too frightened to try. Some accounts say they physically refused to come up when called. Others suggest they simply could not. Anne Bonny and Mary Read came up. The 2 women, armed and furious, held the deck against Barnett's crew as long as they could. By some accounts, Anne called down through the hatch to the men below, demanding, then pleading, then screaming at them to come and fight. The men did not come. The ship was taken. Calico Jack Rackham and his male crew were tried in a court of admiralty in Jamaica in November of 1720. The verdict was never in doubt. They were found guilty of piracy and sentenced to death. Rackham was hanged on November 18th. His body, like Blackbeard's before him, was displayed in a gibbet as a warning to others. Anne Bonny was permitted a final visit with him before his execution. The words she said to him were recorded, and they have echoed across 3 centuries. She told him that she was sorry to see him there, but that if he had fought like a man, he need not have been hanged like a dog. There's no account of his response. Mary Read and Anne Bonny were also tried, also found guilty, also sentenced to death, but both women made the same announcement to the court. They were pregnant. In English law, a pregnant woman could not be executed. The life of the unborn child had to be protected. Both sentences were stayed. Mary Read never saw her freedom. She died in prison in Jamaica, most likely of fever, sometime in 1721. She had survived a life of extraordinary difficulty, a childhood built on deception, wars, loss, and reinvention, only to die in a jail cell on a Caribbean island, waiting for a future that never came. And Bonny's fate is the great unsolved question of the story. There's no record of her execution. There's no record of her death in prison. There are suggestions, unverified, tantalizing, that her father, who had rebuilt himself once before, managed to use his wealth and connections to secure her release, that she returned to the Carolinas, that she remarried, lived quietly, and died in old age under a different name. No one knows. Like Henry Every before her, Anne Bonny may have simply walked back into the world and disappeared, leaving behind only the story, the legend, and the unanswerable question of what became of the girl who chose fire. Thank you for joining me tonight on Pirate History. Anne Bonny and Mary Read were not the first women to live outside the boundaries that their world drew for them. They will not be the last. But they did it on the open sea, with a cutlass in hand, in the most dangerous profession of their age. And when the moment came that defined them, when every man around them had surrendered to rum and fear and the comfortable weight of giving up, they were the ones still standing on the deck. The sea, in the end, does not care who you are supposed to be. It only asks what you are willing to do. Until next time, I wish you a calm and peaceful night.